Historical British war films. What are the rookie errors and what are the authentic details that are actually important? My reasoning for creating this project is to create a research resource for filmmakers, including myself, to reference in the production of British-based historical war films. This will include a catalogue of information on British historical personal equipment and weapons, focusing on that which was used by an individual soldier in combat. I will also discuss the point at which historical accuracy has to compromise in the interest of an engaging narrative. This source of information will be suited best to filmmakers who don't know the finer points of historical uniforms and equipment of the British Army in particular. It will also allow those who may not have the resources for in-depth research to understand what compromises they can make and what they can get right without the need for expensive props or items. This could include documentary productions involving dramatic recreations that perhaps don't have as much budget compared to the overall project. Could also be useful for segments from within TV dramas that involve a flashback to several years in the past, or perhaps something that involves time travel like Doctor Who, or other kinds of one-off appearances within another show that again perhaps don't have as much resources behind them as a dedicated World War II or World War I themed film would. Another factor is that this is actually an incredibly useful central resource for myself to refresh my memory on the things that I need to bear in mind whilst making a film. I aim to make the format of my research more engaging with a much more multimedia approach that will include things like videos and audio files and images. I want to include things that convey information visually, using examples and being able to actually explain how these things are used, what details need to be got right, and how to correctly wear things. I mean, a lot of the problems with webbing and equipment that you get in war films is simply the actors and extras not knowing how to wear these things, and that's quite important to bear in mind. And it's a lot easier to show that with a visual approach. It's a lot easier to do a video to camera talking about this piece of webbing goes here, and normally you'd wear it a bit higher up your back or something like that. It's a lot easier to show that than it is to simply describe it. I'll also lay out the information in a very easy to follow bullet point type write-up, which gives you the headline information of what you need to know in relation to a specific piece of equipment or uniform. The more in-depth description and visual explanations of that will be shown alongside in video format or image format accompanying the write-up. Interviews will also be done in a video or audio format to allow the knowledge and information to come right from the source. It will allow the interviewees to bring their own flavour and to bring their own personality to the information, which makes it much easier to digest. Some of the initial sources that I've already used in the past for a lot of my work, and extensive sources within the worlds of reenacting and filmmaking. To begin with, we have Khaki Web, which is an extensive source of information on the iterative development of British webbing equipment specifically, including personal kit modifications that would have been made by individual soldiers in the field, and how those things would have been used by soldiers in the field, and how that changed over time, because it's quite important to understand how soldiers were using equipment at certain points in time, not just how it was intended to be used, because those two things are quite different more often than not. Whilst it also has a lot of information on the original prescribed way to use the equipment, including scans of the original pamphlets which showed how to wear it as the designers intended. However, it also includes a lot of references in terms of how it was used in combat, how the soldiers would wear their webbing differently from individual to individual, and some of the modifications that were made in the field to make the equipment more suitable for purpose. Another website that's very useful is Tales from the Supply Depot. It's an open source format, so a lot of the articles are sent in by different collectors and historians from across the country, so it has a lot of different perspectives on a lot of different areas of equipment, which makes it quite useful. Another source is Forgotten Weapons, and they have a collection of videos on their YouTube channel as well as write-ups on their website on the mechanical and developmental histories of a variety of firearms. This is quite useful for determining the exact models and modifications of small arms in use during a specific period. That's quite important to get right for a different era. For example, a British Army Lee Enfield rifle that was in use at the beginning of the war in 1914 would not be the same as the configuration of a Lee-Enfield rifle at the end of the war in 1918. By that point, there was a lot of changes between those two rifles, and although those things are not necessarily noticeable to the untrained eye, if you're not going to get it right, you at least need to know the things that you're getting wrong. Something I'm also going to talk about in this project is looking at existing case studies of historical war films and analysing the things that they got right and the things that they got wrong in terms of individual equipment and webbing and how it was used. These two examples are quite good for that because they have a lot of good production values behind them. They had a lot of budget, and so there's a lot of equipment to look at. But it's interesting to see the things that had to be compromised on in the interest of making a good story, and also the things that had to be compromised on in the interest of things like extras and having a large volume of people. Because if you look closely, especially with something like Dunkirk, you can notice that a lot of soldiers are not as fully equipped as they would have actually been in 1939. And that's quite a good thing to compare to 1917, because 1917 does an exceptionally good job of making it appear that every single soldier in the film has a full bag of kit on them. And although it isn't always the case if you look at extremely closely, it does a very good job of creating that impression. And I think that's quite important because it's a bit more successful at that. And I think that's quite a good thing to talk about in terms of filmmaking, is it's about making the most of what you have. And you have to focus on your main characters, make them the most kitted out because they're going to be seen the most up close and for the longest. But it's also interesting to look at how you can make the most out of your extras and give them enough kit to make them look fully kitted out without needing to do the full hog and give them every piece of equipment under the sun. So another element of my project is to try and get industry and historical expert opinions on the matter of historical authenticity. Some of those potential interviewees that I've got lined up are, to start with, Rifleman Moore, reenactor and knowledgeable source on the details of British equipment, personal items and uniform, and goes into quite a lot of depth in terms of what items were used when and what the individual soldier would have had with them and how it would have been used. So things right down to your wash roll. Another potential interviewee is Jonathan Ferguson, who is the creator of firearms at the Royal Armouries in Leeds. He's an experienced researcher and has hands-on knowledge with firearms practices, which is quite important in terms of a military film, because you need to get the handling of a firearm correct. A trained soldier would know how to handle their rifle, and that really comes across in film, because quite often a lot of the extras you see don't know what they're doing and are just holding a big stick effectively. So knowing the protocol for specifically the time and period you're trying to portray is quite important, and that's something that he's very knowledgeable on. Another potential interviewee is a YouTuber by the name of Airsoft Mike. Now, I don't know much about his film work because most of his front-facing YouTube channel stuff he does very much focus on reviewing airsoft, with quite a bit of a focus on historical firearms because he supplies those as props to filmmakers. So it'd be interesting to get his industry point of view in terms of supplying those and the process that goes with that. He'll also have good experience when it comes to trying to identify what inaccuracies you have to be aware of when using real imitation firearms, because more often than not, especially in the airsoft market, the cheaper you go, the less accurate firearms will be, and they can often vary quite a lot from their real life counterparts. So it's quite important to know what compromises you're making so that you can avoid making those too obvious in your actual production. My fourth interviewee is the only person I've got in contact with so far. Now, this is someone by the name of Matthew Russell, who worked on a Seafret music video supplying the props and the uniforms for the soldiers in that film. This is someone who I've come across within the airsoft community. This would be a very good industry perspective on a smaller budget production and allow us to talk about what compromises have to be made, what's most important to get right when you have those limitations, and how to make the most out of the equipment and replicas that you have to hand. Each of my interviewees will have very different perspectives on authenticity in film, and as such I will need to tailor my questions to each of them to ensure I get the most out of their experiences and knowledge. Questions of the importance of equipment and uniform accuracy in film will be most interesting to ask those with a reenactment or costume background. It will be particularly interesting from a reenactment point of view to see what they consider most important in film and to hear what things that they often notice films doing wrong. It It would also be interesting to ask questions from a perspective of firearms use and how important the handling and model of weapons used in a production are to the authenticity of the film. What I aim to achieve with this ultimately is to provide a better standard of authenticity within lower budget productions, but also to understand what compromises have to be made in order to make an engaging narrative. It's quite important that if you're going to make compromises in terms of historical accuracy, that you understand what compromises you are making. As soon as you start making errors unintentionally, it becomes a lot more noticeable. And that's what I intend to create a resource to help prevent.